Thank you, Peg. Good evening. You guys are used to hearing from me by now. But just by way of introduction, I'm Elizabeth Kirk. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Ethics and Culture. And on behalf of the Center, it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Helen Alvare. Professor Alvare joins us from Washington, D.C., where she is an associate professor at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, where she teaches courses in property, family law, and legislation. I actually had the pleasure of teaching with Professor Alvare during the 2002-2003 school year, and occasionally had the added compliment of being confused with her or mistaken for her a couple of times. I think it had more to do with the hair color and hairstyle rather than any more profound similarity, but that was quite a compliment. Professor Alvare received her JD from Cornell University in 1984 and a master's degree in theology from the Catholic University of America in 1989. Prior to joining the law faculty at CUA, Professor Alvare served in many other capacities. She began her legal career as a litigation associate in Philadelphia. She then went on to accept a position as a staff attorney for the National Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C. She continued working for the conference as the Director of Information and Planning for the Bishop's Pro-Life Office. And in that capacity, she represented the American Catholic bishops addressing issues of abortion, euthanasia, feminism, capital punishment, disability, population issues, in television, radio, print media, and public lectures. She also testified on behalf of the bishops before federal congressional committees and lobbied members of Congress on federal legislation concerning those issues. Professor Alvare also serves the Holy See, most recently having given a plenary address on the family in the social order at a conference sponsored by the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. She served as the U.S. press representative for the Holy See delegation to the United Nations Conference on Women in Beijing and to the United Nations Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. She has also served as a consultant to the Pontifical Academy for Human Life. And she recently represented the President and our nation at the inaugural Mass of Pope Benedict XVI. In addition to all this, Professor Alvare is a prolific writer, having authored numerous articles, book chapters, encyclopedia entries, and a prolific lecturer, having spoken at conferences around the world. It was actually during one of her public appearances on behalf of the bishops that I met Helen for the first time. She probably doesn't remember this. It was March 30th, 1997. Before any of you think I have a fabulous memory, the internet has all sorts of details like this out there. I was a young attorney in Chicago, and that evening I attended a debate at Loyola University Chicago between Helen and Sarah Weddington, who was the attorney who successfully argued for Ms. Roe in the Roe versus Wade case. So I was a young attorney, and of course it goes without saying that I was impressed by Helen's intellectual firepower and her ability to clearly articulate her arguments and to make them accessible to a group of mostly undergraduate students. But what impressed me most about her was her charm, her spunk, her humor, and her cheerful persuasiveness. Needless to say, she won the debate, but she did so in a way that could win hearts. Helen has said that you will not command attention if you are viewed primarily as someone who is against something. And she certainly has a gift for making her message positive and attractive. Actually, we Irish have a term for people with this gift. The term is known as Irish diplomacy. It's the ability to tell a man to go to hell so that he looks forward to making the trip. Helen has this ability. And we are so fortunate that a woman of this ability and with so many other important responsibilities is also a friend of the Center for Ethics and Culture. Professor Alvare serves on our board of advisors. She has been an invited speaker to our Culture of Death and Culture of Life conferences, and she delivered the J. Philip Clark Family Lecture on Medical Ethics for our annual Medical Ethics Conference in 2003. We are so honored to have her here again with us tonight. Her talk is entitled Catholic University, Mediator of Grace and Truth. Please join me in welcoming Helen Alvare.
Hello. I cannot ever live up to all of that at once. It's like dumping on an undergraduate everything that's going to be due from September to June, you know, and I get overwhelmed. I'm feeling overwhelmed by my past exertions and hope I can live up to them. I have to say, and I think this is probably as it should be when you hear what I have to say about Catholic universities, that I am regularly intimidated by theology and philosophy faculty because of my deep belief in the superiority of what it is they're thinking about versus what I'm thinking about. So that said, I proceed with trepidation. I have decided to take up a subject at a time when I spoke to Dan about it, that where I was at a rather low point in thinking about the topic of Catholic universities, and so it was a real challenge for me. Most certainly, my life has been tied up with institutions with Catholic mission. My very first law firm I chose because they represented the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. They also represented Jewish and Lutheran seminaries and schools, and I wanted to be associated with that. Then I go to the Bishops' Conference, and I go to Catholic University. In the last 3 weeks alone, I've been to 4 different Catholic universities, including my own, to speak or to present a paper. And so it is a topic about which I care maybe even a little too much. What I would like to do is to begin my story with a story that characterizes my concerns that led me to take up my topic. Every year, myself and many other professors participate in an auction at Catholic University where we auction off stuff and the students take the money and use it for public interest law fellowships for various lawyers in D.C. I had auctioned a dinner at my house. I do a 6-course black tie dinner that I serve with wine for every course for about 10 to 16 students. The school was in the middle of a dean search at the time, and the students' conversation turned to an inquiry of whether the rumor was true, that we were looking for a Catholic dean. The demeanor of the students was as a lawyer ready to pounce on a guilty opponent. As a law professor, of course, I answered their question with a question. I said, would you feel similarly if Brigham Young University was searching for a Mormon? Not at all, came the reply, but that was because they envisioned Brigham Young to be somehow less modern, less generous in its outlooks toward other faiths than a Catholic university, which should not discriminate. There's so much wrong with this exchange, not the least of which is their view of the Latter-day Saints, but for our purposes tonight, I use it only to illustrate the gap between even some of our simplest aspirations for a Catholic university and the message on the ground for students and professors there. Stories like that one are part of, and maybe I'm expressing something that you have experienced too, a cycle of inspiration and despair that fill the days of earnest Catholic professors and students on the campuses of nominally Catholic universities. The academic year may open with a university mass, where we're genuinely uplifted by the community's presence at the Eucharist together, by the aspirations for the university voiced sonorously by the president or the resident bishop, handmade posters exhorting students to spend some of their incredible energy on the poor or hurricane victims, absolutely sprout from the walls of the student centers month in and month out. In these events, we see the Word of God gathering people to himself 2,000 years after his birth. Then we watch in disbelief as these same Catholic universities hire tiny minorities of faculty members or deans with any knowledge or commitment to the Catholic tradition, or hire even those with antipathy toward it. We attend faculty meetings with no context, where even the most fundamental aspirations of a Catholic university are up for grabs. We see Catholic universities honor public figures, maybe with very visible public stances against some key position of the church. We begin to think we are unreasonable, that we are out of step, out of sync with the place we came to on account of its religious affiliation. Maybe we're narrow, dogmatic, uncompassionate, nastily triumphalistic. Maybe we don't understand what this place is all about. Simply to set out this bipolar experience is to bring to mind another bipolar experience that many of us have regarding the church. In fact, it is with the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church herself. On the one hand, it's the place of some of the most courageous refusals in the world today to go along with, as our Pope Benedict XVI tells us, the prevailing banal bourgeois notion that life is complicated and short, and I better get what I need, how, and when I can. On peace, on poverty, on human life, on love, on marriage, the Church communicates a message as worth living for as it has proved worth dying for. At these times, she looks like the rock against which the gates of hell will not prevail. At other times, she is the largest stumbling block for the public, for Catholics, for anyone to the faith, an object of scorn for victims of clerical sexual abuse, their families, and the public, for groups unjustly treated by the Church in history, for ordinary Catholics looking for answers to their deepest misgivings and spiritual longings, and finding maybe sometimes an inattentive or non-serious local church, or just one without the stomach for controversy. Happily, the lot of us who experience the Church in this bipolar way are far from alone with our sincere questions. A couple of German theologians, one named Karl Rahner and the other one who happens to be our present Holy Father, have faced with surprising candor the dilemma of the Church as stumbling block. Reading their works on this question, as I tend to do as a way of bucking myself up on a regular basis, I was at the beach a few months ago, and I was reading Rahner's, on the necessity of the church. And people don't realize that I need that. I know they need The Secret Life of Bees, but I need it right now. I need to read this. I couldn't help be taken when I was reading this with the parallels between the church and the Catholic University in this regard. It led me to what I would like to do this evening, which is to use these authors' description of the journey from disdain to hope respecting the church to try and articulate our journey from disdain to hope with Catholic universities. How I'm going to do this is to begin by considering reasons for discomfort and then proceed to signs of hope. Not surprisingly, the journey will be one of conversion, though maybe not the conversion you might first suspect. If I were to ask a group of earnest Catholic scholars to list examples of how Catholic universities obscure the path of salvation versus lighting it, probably I would get a good old-fashioned litany of the kind you used to hear at the high masses, okay? And much as I'm sure this audience likes a good litany, though it turns out a closer look at this litany actually leads to the ability to characterize this list of complaints according to about 3 themes. Of course, I need to do that to get you all out of here tonight, too. First, Catholic universities' inclination to act as though they are self-organizing versus at all times called by God and charged to respond. Second, universities failing to understand that an essential element of their existence is a response as community. And third, allowing secular ideas versus Catholic principles to determine their behavior. These secular principles range from a reluctance to be seen as stewards of a tradition versus its master, a willingness to conflate what is new automatically with what is progress, a resistance to the notion that freedom and a search for truth might have a lot of overlapping space instead of be contrary. So I'm going to turn first to Catholic universities' predilection to sometimes operate as though they are self-organized versus as a response to a call. As an introductory matter, I should note that I am not offering here a theological argument to the effect that at some point Jesus Christ called aside a would-be college administrator and gave him or her a message on the order of, "Thou art whoever, and upon this rock I will build my school." I'm not making that kind of argument about the rock of the university. I am rather suggesting, as a matter of logical deduction, both from Jesus' role as a teacher and from human beings' inherently social nature, that Cardinal Newman was right when he offered that a university does but contemplate a necessity of our nature, these places of communication of thought through the personal intercourse of wide groups of people. Surely, too, there is a sign for us in Jesus having gathered groups about him through his entire ministry, from his beloved apostles and disciples to his table fellowship, from his conversation with the elders to his conversation before the Sanhedrin. He had constant exchanges passing on instruction about the Old Covenant and the New. Jesus did this in history to historical groups of people who preserved his words, his teaching, organized themselves, passed it on, without real historical communities such as Catholic universities that remained devoted to this, rather than a church trying to organize itself through private personal conversions and conversations without community. God's offer of salvation, his calling together a community of love, would simply be less visibly present in history. I have a vivid memory of understanding this sign of university's call when, as a first-year associate at a law firm, seeking the meaning of anything in the 12 hours a day I was spending on corporate litigation, and I prepared for this for so many years, and I kept wondering, even at the 4th month, I was developing psoriasis, a colitis problem, a smoking habit, and thinking, what is this all for? I began to read Catholic theology. And I then said to myself, I really need to go to a Catholic university to tell me what to read, to help me spiritually and practically to grapple with my daily existence. Now, you can imagine, or maybe you can't, that a lawyer reading theology at night — I was going to 4 nights a week of night schools at every Catholic — before it was over, I went to Rosemont, Cabrini, Villanova, St. Joe's for whatever courses they had. This did not play too well with my law firm. The joke I used to have is, don't tell the managing partner I'm studying theology. He thinks I'm playing piano at the cat house, because they were not interested in theology. They thought of it as a detraction from my 14 to 16-hour-a-day work commitment. Eventually, though, I was simply drawn to Catholic University of America for what they could tell me to read, to enlighten me on both an intellectual and a spiritual level. Against or blind to their nature as an ongoing response to God's ongoing call, some Catholic universities look like they're responding to what? To passing opinions, to fiscal necessities, to the drumbeat of the rankings race. When I see that U.S. News and World Report hit the stands, I don't even want to go back to the next faculty meeting. There are obvious signs of this orientation in the university proper. First, sometimes there's evidence of, among leaders at the university, a real dearth of visible interest in their own pilgrimage, their own relationship with God. If the leaders are not on their own pilgrimage, it is very difficult for them to assist a vast university community on its own pilgrimage. I was at Mass several months ago when I saw second in command at a Catholic university across from me in church, and I thought, make a note to go see him when I'm gone. And instead, I watched him walk from communion out the front door and get into a car that was waiting for him. And I thought, that's a problem. It just doesn't fit. I hope none of his students are here. As a result, and I think you can already guess it, we have a proliferation of bureaucracy. Programs, mission statements, guest speakers, a lot of that, with little apparent coherence and no sense of forward motion towards something in particular. The school has the look of a puzzle rather than a composition. This, in turn, leads to an absence of a sense among professors, students, alums, a lack of a sense of clarity or transparency. There's a growth of cynicism and a greater willingness to ask, what is motivating the university leadership? Sometimes with a concomitant willingness to attribute pretty low motives to them that aren't even true. Ironically, by not appealing to an authority above and outside themselves, the authority of university leaders is more deeply and sometimes unfairly questioned. A second common error Catholic universities seem to exhibit is a failure to understand that we're called to act in community. Rahner has written of the necessity of the church as a historical response to God's historic and irreversible call and offer of grace and salvation. Newman understands community as a necessary, not an accidental element of a university, given the social nature of men and women. I also recall the thought of a favorite professor and mentor at Catholic University in the philosophy department, Father Sokolowski, who might add to this that it's only through the diversity and even the opposition of thought that can be found in community at a university that we can really understand what it is we are learning and what it is we wish to learn. Unfortunately, Catholic universities can fail to understand the communal necessity. And there occurs programs, there occurs between disciplines at Catholic University, between campus ministry and disciplines, between the administration and campus ministry, any of the above groups, or between the religious order that animated the place and disciplines, a real disconnect, whether because budgets are small and everybody sees it as a zero-sum game, or I like to think it's a lot more a dull reason for it. It's because everybody else in the world sees those gaps between professors' teaching schedules and sees them as invitations to invite you to advise this or write that. And Catholic or university professors, like professors everywhere, are deeply overcommitted to projects here, there, and everywhere. Regarding the fragmentation between professions and disciplines and professors and campus ministry, etc., consider that all new students receive a rather lengthy orientation to the place, to its mission, to its habits, to its various schools. And to my knowledge, professors don't receive any similar orientation, nor do many administrators. Turning to the third and perhaps most noted weakness in Catholic universities today, their secular inclinations. A list, they're not exhaustive, might include, first, a tendency toward the very American notion that more is better. Self-denial is not an option. More programs, more speakers, more courses. Even if by having more of something, one diminishes maybe the most important programs, the most signal voices at the university. More luxurious campuses because, well, parents and students don't really want to spend that money at a shabby place versus a luxurious place. Second, a suspicion of claims to objective knowledge. A worry even that it will seem uncharitable to claim to know something for sure. You can easily see how this often leads to suspicion ab initio of what comes from the church, where our Holy Father and our bishops are more apt to speak in declarative sentences than a lot of other people. And as being the pontifical university in the United States, you can imagine that this is a suspicion that applies to us twofold. In theology in particular, this tendency is associated with the intellectual practice of putting out many, many questions, but not a lot of answers. Pope Benedict has noted about this tendency that it can easily drive listeners into one of two problematic camps, either make cynics out of them or drive them out toward a fundamental theology because they really would like to have some answers. Another secular tendency is to act as if statistics are among one of God's most important measurements and a true indicator of importance or truth. They can lead many Catholic universities to avoid speaking on matters that appear to have little chance of public popularity. It's true especially, and being someone who came from a pro-life background, who does stuff on marriage and family, and let me just tell you, for any who are considering making this transition, that marriage and family is a whole lot harder than speaking on abortion. The cultural scene, the legal scene on that right now, and the social is so neuralgic that it is very, very difficult. In these areas in particular, it is tempting for Catholic universities to speak out in a muffled or indirect or less than strong way. And it's true, I think, most particularly of the teachings about the human body and what its very nature might indicate. Another secular tendency one sees is the tendency to make God unimportant in the world. One sees this result, for example, in a tendency, even on Catholic faculties, to see cross-disciplinary scholarship that delves either into theology proper or into Catholic social teaching as somehow less than first-rate scholarship. And certainly, as we know, and I know in the legal field, it is very rare for one of the signal law journals to publish a piece that would have this kind of content. It's seen perhaps as a sign that we are actually trying to evangelize or to extend or increase the influence of Catholic thought, and that is seen as per se unacceptable. A final sign of secularity that I would note, and one that I think is a particular temptation at universities, where academics are urged constantly, tell me something new, tell me something original, is the reflexive tendency to equate novelty with progress. Of course, I'm almost a dinosaur on the other end of things these days, dealing as I do in family law. I realize you can't go back to, 15th century marriage models, but the statements, the whole cohabitation area of law, which was started by the Marvin case, was premised on the notion that cohabitation was the best thing that ever happened to marriage, and it was going to turn around California's divorce rate. California also proposed that no-fault divorce as a searching inquiry into why people were getting divorced was going to slow down divorce from the old reflexive, did you catch your husband in adultery, which was very easy to do. You just paid the secretary to show up at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon to evidence it. We're going to slow down divorce during that. So what I rebel against is, of course, some of the things that are new that really are not a sign of progress at all. You can imagine where this desire for things that are new and its association with progress leaves the teachings of the Church, explicitly conscious of maintaining fidelity to an unbroken 2,000-year-old teaching authority. I do see disdain, especially for our teachings in the marriage and family area. Universities are tempted then to suppress speech, or when bringing long-held teachings to bear on modern questions, to use the most minimal language with a tone that I do detect as defensive, with communication bearing none of the marks of that inspired, creative, and enthusiastic communication that both Popes John Paul II and Benedict XVI have so specifically requested of academic experts. Oh, with that catalog complete, it is time, and you're probably thinking high time, to turn to consideration of why. Why do we continue to hope and have reason to hope in Catholic universities? To be visible, effective mediators of God's grace and truth. I'm going to suggest first 2 general answers and then 2 specific responses to the specific failures I had previously identified according to the themes of call, community, and secularization. A first general response. It appears that what we are observing in the shortcomings of Catholic universities is part of the phenomenon Pope Benedict XVI has so gorgeously phrased. He took something negative and wow, did he make something out of it, as the shape of grace in history. In other words, God has chosen and continues to choose to act often through weak men and women and weak institutions. It is a specific way, in fact, in which we perceive God's presence. The weeds and the wheat are specifically allowed to grow together. For my taste, the destruction of the weeds does not come half soon enough, and I want it all in my lifetime, at least. Yet, in this very proximity, and I think this is something Father Sokolowski would be right on, the beauty of the wheat is that much more evident. Its content, its substance is that much more evident. God has bound himself again, to use Benedict's words, to the dirty hands of men and women, and let himself be bound by us. In his sacrifice, and Ronner has this wonderful concept, Jesus has already encompassed every conceivable rejection. And I would add to that, even sophisticated, intellectual rejection by some of the finest minds of our time. Even that he has in advance already encompassed and triumphed over. Though at times, many times, we may doubt this. God is with us and has not stopped loving us. He has assured us He will not let the project that is humankind be a total failure, as Benedict phrases it. I would extend this to say that this must include the signal and essential human project of applying our reason to the truest ends of union with God. Mention of this human project leads to a second general answer to the question about Catholic universities' possibility as mediators of grace. It could be indicated in a simplistic way, but I don't think an unimportant way, by pointing to your presence here, to the variety of intellectual efforts and topics at the many sessions of this conference, and to our being called together by this fine center as a community. And let's face it, don't we all draw some strength from this? Don't we all believe when we go home that there are many more fine minds than we previously knew working on the problem? Present at Catholic universities are many who, like ourselves, are earnestly seeking to make the good news come alive today. Pope Benedict has observed that when the Church has reached low points in its history, it has always been the witness of saints with a certain directness and simplicity to their grand efforts that has revived the Church. Think of St. Benedict. Of course, he always mentions St. Benedict first. Saints Francis, Dominic, Teresa of Avila, one of my all-time favorites, Ignatius, and others. We are the university community, and we must look to ourselves, as Rana admonishes, not to add any further weak witness or quibbling or destructive versus constructive critiques to the burdens already faced by our universities. The university's continual conversion begins in our own offices. Certainly this process sometimes necessitates conflict with the university. Oh, I'm all for that. I mean, I don't think that should be dropped as a tactic. But we can't allow conflict to define our role. It's not enough. It must also include obedience to God, self-donation, self-sacrifice, self-denial, courage, and humility. I mean, on a very practical level, every time I think about what it might involve if I have a new faculty member who has expressed some antipathy toward the mission, or an administrator who I meet who wants me to play down that the student pro-life group is having a talk, and well, just don't give it too much publicity. What? Or a dean who suggests that, having a talk on Stenberg versus Carhart, the partial birth abortion case, is very brave of us. That rather than my typical low, failed Christian response, that it may actually cost me an afternoon of conversation, that it may cost me a lunch, a coffee. And for me, I mean, this may not be huge for you, but I have 3 kids at home. I try to, when I travel, this is the longest trip I'll have been on for a couple of years. I do anything to do my business and get home, and not spend time on what I might believe are fruitless causes. I can't have that attitude. When I have new faculty that come in and there is an opportunity to orient them to our hopes, that's time that I have to spend. If there is a university administrator who is ready to get off the phone after telling me to, keep the pro-life group's conference quiet and try not to encourage any protesters, I have to stay on the phone. These are what I mean, and they may be a different group of sacrifices for you. Turning now to how Catholic universities today then actively show evidence that all is not lost with respect to the categories of call, community, and a rejection of secularization. As to evidence that the university sees itself as called, not simply as a self-organizing business or educational, institution with a good idea, I believe there's affirmative evidence in the continuing rising up of new Catholic universities and institutes and programs in our present day. In fact, I believe we're witnessing a very active and important period today in this regard. New universities and institutes with distinctive charisms that are clearly responding to signs of the times are arising. Some of the signs of the times are the need for Catholic voices in leadership on global justice issues, the critical need for a response to the threats posed to the human person by some technologies, and to the threats posed to society by ideologies explicitly rejecting an active, just, and loving God. I would also note here, as a sign of Catholic University's understanding the imperatives of a call, something that may seem a really minimal matter to you, and I would never lead this section with it, but in honesty, I had to mention it. Considering the charged secular environment in which this occurs, it is not minimal. It's this: the tendency, when push comes to shove, when the Catholic position on a neuralgic issue simply must be said, to say it, to take the position even on neuralgic social issues. You don't find that in politics. You don't find it in the media. You don't find it in our entertainment. You do still find it at Catholic universities. I'm thinking, for instance, of a very difficult incident that Catholic University of America had involving the establishment of an NAACP chapter. The university made the demand that the NAACP chapter explicitly reject one of its fundamental positions of the national NAACP in favor of Roe v. Wade, which is essentially abortion at any time for any reason. And that had to be done as a condition of their campus presence. We had a media circus, we had the leadership of the NAACP in, and the university held its ground that the NAACP was welcome, but this position was not. This was interpreted and continues to be, and I think I saw some evidence of it in our admission pool this year, as racially insensitive. But the university, when push came to shove, said, here's our position, you may not promote this thing, that is its opposite. Also, as a sign of the call, I believe, are those frequent celebrations of Mass, adoration, and rosaries that go on at every different college in our universities. I have noticed in my school a dramatic uptick in these in recent years, and so it brings it to mind. As to Catholic universities understanding of themselves as called specifically to act as communities of faith. All Catholic universities have been uplifted by, again, I believe, the example of the recently forming Catholic universities and institutes. I've been a member of the founding board of governors of the Ave Maria School of Law, and I interacted several times early on with the St. Thomas University School of Law. I have to tell you, it was bordering on a retreat experience to visit these institutions during their formative years and to take in the palpable awareness of the students and the faculty and the administration that the success of the one institution depended on everybody's combining their best efforts to succeed together. Sacrifice, mutual support, and community celebration around the Eucharist really characterized these efforts. Given that every Catholic university in the U.S. today, if it has eyes to see and ears to hear, should know that it is locked in a struggle with much of prevailing culture, there is no reason why this sense of community could not be sustained in extant as well as in new institutions. The community consciousness is also preserved at Catholic universities by the pride of place that, let's face it, we give our theology and philosophy faculties. It is not at all uncommon to find, even if unspoken, the sense that as goes the theology and philosophy faculty, so goes the school in terms of Catholic identity. Obviously, this has produced some very bumpy rides for Catholic universities over the years. At the same time, the very prominence of these departments, whose stated objects of investigation encompass the whole woman, the whole man, all of nature, and all of our relationship with God, is a sign that there has been preserved in this way the right context for the rest of us to operate. As a final and very simple sign of community consciousness of the university, I think, are the persons of those priests, brothers, and sisters who, present on campus, stopped here and there, as students will do every time they walk by, particularly if they're in habit, are the visible reminders of the common purposes we share. When I'm having a really bad day at my office, in my beautiful office, I go out of my beautiful office and I walk up to the Prisbilla Center, and then I walk up toward Caldwell Hall. And one of the delights that I always see every day is one of the members of a religious community or a diocesan priest in conversation with a group of students on campus. It is and we have our own chaplain who's just lovely. and is celebrating Mass more infrequently at the school. It is a visible sign of our community. As to evidence regarding promising signs in the struggle of Catholic universities against secularization, maybe this evidence, the positive kind, is the least visible, yet it exists, and likely in ways we would not have conjured ourselves. On the question of the world's consumeristic impulses, more is better. It turns out many of our Catholic universities have not been required to face that demon, as Father Bill raised today as a fact. They have rather struggled with too little funding for a very long time. Their purposes for existing will never be mistaken for materialism at many of these campuses. As Father put it, maybe it's just because their virtue hasn't been tested, and yet the fact of the matter is we bear fruit from this absence of testing. I'm sure we're being tested in other ways. It is a burden for faculty, staff, and administrators alike. It's also a context, though, that helps make the college very clear about why it continues to exist. We struggle so that Catholic higher education can continue to exist in this community or with the particular charism that we have. As to the secular impulse to reject the old in favor of the new, to reject claimed authoritative sources, at this time, 40 years after Vatican II, particularly with respect to its constitution on the Church in the modern world, and at this juncture in U.S. and world history, I have sensed that Catholic scholars are making notable and substantial claims to apply received wisdom about peace, poverty, development, consumerism, human life, marriage and family, to current problems. And I have sensed a confidence. I just wonder if that's true on your campuses as well. I have sensed it on mine. A confidence that the Catholic reflection on this, the critical questions that come specifically from being Catholic and being immersed in the tradition, a confidence that they are adding light even to the secular debate and not clouding it or speaking in words that the public can understand. I've found this very much in my own field in marriage and family, where you cannot pick up a newspaper without an empirical study demonstrating that many of the problems that Vatican II talked about in this area have come to pass. I could go on with further specific examples for another long day, but in conclusion, I just want to offer a few reflections. To some, my comments may have seemed too critical of the university. To say, on the other hand, having read Benedict saying, "Oh, I know what you all fear, that the Church isn't really one holy Catholic and apostolic at all, and you've got a point," that kind of gave me some guts to come forward here and say, if he can do it, I'll bet I can too. Also, however, I do have a career background in pro-life activism where I spent more of my time disabusing inanity than I spent, my job was pretty much to blow stupid ideas as opposed, and then if there was time, but there were so many stupid ideas, if there was time, then I could get to the rest of it. So I know I tend to the critical, and I acknowledge that. To others, my observations about the signs of hope may have seemed Pollyanna-ish, okay? So I know that we've come from many different experiences in universities. But I have spoken as I have, not simply because I found empirical evidence on one side or the other, although I think I did. I have spoken because it is my fear that sometimes the very strongest critics of the mission of Catholic universities are people whose tremendous idealism about seeing the kingdom of God realized on earth in these institutions cannot help but be disappointed because of the shape of grace in history. And I would rather be on the side of those seeking hope than taking the risk that any of you would be lost to the cause. Thank you very much.